Hey, welcome back to my channel. My name is Katie and this is Catherine the 19th. Today I'm going to show you how to shoot in manual on your DSLR. I know for a lot of people when they buy their first DSLR, they're super excited to start using it. They aren't used to all of the controls and different things that you can do to alter your image. So today I'm going to give you a crash course in how to shoot in manual when you have literally zero knowledge on how to do it. So you've had your DSLR for a little while now, you've gotten used to shooting in auto and you're really loving the images it produces, but you don't know how to start changing them. Well, there are 2 steps for you to start getting used to the idea of shooting in manual before you jump in to full manual. So my first tip is to try out shooting in the AV and TV options on your DSLR. On the wheel on top of your Canon or Nikon or whatever DSLR, you will probably see some different icons and letters like this. AV and TV are right next to each other, and basically what they mean are aperture priority and shutter speed priority. This means that when you use that setting, all you're going to have to do is either change your aperture or change your shutter speed. So that means that everything else will be in auto except for that one feature, and it'll make it a little bit easier for you to change the settings that you want to without having to worry about fixing the other ones to make your image look good. So those are 2 nice introductory ways for you to get started, but in order to do that, you're going to need to know what shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are. In manual mode, essentially all you're changing are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These are the 3 components that make up the exposure triangle, and they basically affect the lighting, brightness, what we call exposure of an image. So let's jump right into what are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Once you know these, you'll be ready to start adjusting them in manual or adjusting just one of them in aperture or shutter speed priority. Additionally, I'm going to tell you what my standard settings are so that you have a nice base to work with, so you kind of know what numbers you can start with and then adjust from there. So to start off, what is shutter speed? Basically, shutter speed is how long the camera's shutter is open for. So every time you take a picture, there's a shutter that's covering the lens that is going to open to let light in and then shut to stop light from coming in to create the exposure of the picture on the camera sensor. So when you are adjusting shutter speed, you're telling the camera how long you want the shutters to be open for before they close. The longer the shutters are open for, the more light that comes in, so the brighter it is, and the quicker they shut, the less light that gets in. So you might be working with a shutter speed of say like 1/60. That would let quite a bit of light in compared to 1/500, which wouldn't let very much light in. In addition to informing the brightness of the image, shutter speed is also going to provide more or less motion blur depending on how long the shutter is open for. If the shutter is open for a long time and the subject moves while it is open, there's going to be a bit of blurring. But if the shutter is only open for a really short time, there isn't really enough time for the subject to move at all for there to be any kind of blur. Especially when it comes to creating videos, you want a certain amount of motion blur so that it looks more natural and less choppy. But when you're taking photos, it really depends what kind of style of picture you're going for, whether or not you want motion blur. This picture would be an example of an image where there is intentionally a lot of motion blur left to create a certain kind of impression. Whereas this image is an example of a picture where there is very, very little motion blur and the picture is meant to freeze a moment in time. So it really depends on what you're going for, but generally I would say when you're starting out with pictures, a good place to start is a shutter speed of 1/200. That will give you relatively low motion blur, but it will also allow enough light into the camera that it's not going to be a really dark picture. If you're working with video though, I would suggest that you start at a shutter speed of 1/60 or 1/50. This is pretty standard in the video world and it provides the right amount of motion blur for video to look natural to the eye. Don't worry about remembering all this right now because I will review my standard settings at the end of the video. Let's move on to aperture. So what is aperture? Aperture is essentially how wide open the camera lens is. This is a little bit more abstract to wrap your mind around, but I normally like to think of it in terms of a metaphor to the human eye. So in the eye metaphor, the shutter speed would be blinking, how long your eye is open before you shut it again. And aperture would be how wide your eyes are open. I know this doesn't directly translate, but stay with me here. So when you're setting your aperture, you're basically telling your camera how big to make the hole for letting in light. If the camera is this wide open, the shutter speed time is still gonna be the same whether it's this or this, right? So it kind of is working together, these two factors, to create how bright your image is going to be. The numbers associated with aperture are a little bit more confusing because a bigger aperture number is a smaller aperture like this, and a smaller number is big. So for example, if you were shooting at an aperture of 1.4, that's going to be really wide open, that's going to be really bright. But if you were shooting at an aperture of f22, it's going to be really little, it's not going to let very much light in. In addition to informing how bright the picture is, aperture also tells the picture how blurry the background should be. This is where we talk about shallow depth of field or deep depth of field. Everybody really loves those YouTube videos or those pictures where the background is really nice and blurry and the subject is crisply in focus. That's what we would call shallow depth of field, and it is achieved by using a big aperture or like a low number aperture. So f1.4 for instance, or f2.5. Those would be the kind of apertures that you would use to get a really nice blurry background. In contrast, to get a picture where the background is pretty much as in focus as the foreground, you would use a smaller aperture or a bigger number. So like maybe f6 point whatever, or higher numbers up there, 12 maybe, would make the entire picture similarly in focus. Normally, I really like to shoot with a low aperture because I like this kind of artsy bokeh shots where the background is very blurry and the foreground is really crisply in focus. However, there are going to be some circumstances where it's going to be better for you to use a more deep depth of field to make sure that the entire image is in focus. Say for instance, if you were shooting a family picture and you had a big group of people, you want them all to be in focus. You don't want just one person's face to be in focus and no one else's. So in that case, you might want to use somewhere in the range of f4 to f6 kind of, to make sure that the whole picture is in the same focus range rather than just having one person there and everyone else is in the background. Moving on to ISO, the third corner of the exposure triangle. ISO is basically the sensitivity of the camera's sensor to light. If you have a low ISO, say 100 to 200, that would be very low. That would mean that the camera is very insensitive to light, so the picture is going to be darker. And the higher the ISO, say 800 to 1200, the camera is going to be more sensitive, which means the image is going to be brighter. But in addition to informing the brightness of the picture, the ISO also indicates how grainy the picture is going to be. The higher the ISO, the more grain that you're going to see in your picture. I would suggest keeping your ISO a bit lower so that you don't have a lot of graininess in your picture. And then if you want to add grain later, at least you still have your original one that's going to look perfect. To avoid getting grainy pictures, it depends on the camera, but normally I would say you don't want to push 1600 for your ISO. Though certain cameras are really good in low light and can go way up to like ISO 25,000 and stuff like that. But generally with beginner cameras, say like the Canon T3 or T5i, whatever line, you're not going to want to do an ISO much higher than 1200, 1600 I would say, or else it's going to start to look really grainy. So that is a general rundown of the exposure triangle and everything that you need to know to shoot in manual. So to bring it back to the shutter priority and aperture priority modes, I would say that if you're getting started, maybe you just focus on one or the other. Generally, aperture priority is probably going to be more common because you're probably going to want to try to do lower apertures so that you can get a really nice blurry background. So in that case, you can set your camera to the AV mode, and then when you do your little scroll wheel thing, all that's going to change is the aperture. So you can set it as low as you want, and then the camera will adjust the shutter speed and the ISO to make sure that the exposure is correct. But if you want to go full manual, you can jump in with all three options. Generally, there's going to be different scroll wheels or buttons on each camera to be able to change everything. On the 80D, the top camera adjusts the shutter, this back scrollie adjusts the aperture, and then you press a button to change the ISO. On my T3i, I remember there was one scroll wheel at the top, and then you would hold in an AV button on the back to be able to change the aperture. So learn your own camera individually. I'm sure there's lots of tutorials online that can tell you how to physically change each aspect. But what I would suggest when you first start out, these are the settings that you can start with and then build on. These are assuming that you're in a situation where the lighting is like generally pretty good. So maybe you're outside midday on like a cloudy day, or you're in a really well lit room. If it's super dark out, that's definitely going to change the game. So these settings are assuming that you have pretty good lighting in your situation. So you're going to start off with a shutter speed of around 200. This will give you a good base for not too much blur in your pictures, but also it won't be too dark. If you're shooting video, start with 1/60. In video, I pretty much always keep it 1/60 because I like to have the same amount of motion blur in all of my videos, and then I'll adjust the ISO and aperture to make sure the lighting's correct. For your aperture, I would just put on whatever lens you have that has the lowest f-stop and crank it down to that. So if that's f1.4, that's great. If it's, f2.5, that's great. If you can only get to 4.5, that's okay too. Just bring the aperture pretty much as low as it can go, and then you're gonna adjust your ISO accordingly. If you're in a bright room and you're doing shutter speed 1/200 and you got your aperture at like 1.5, then you're gonna make your ISO pretty low, like maybe 200 to 300. But if you're only at f4.5, then you might need a higher ISO. What I like to do is just keep changing the settings and clicking pictures, checking it, and seeing what your picture looks like, and just keep changing until you get exposure that you like. You can also look at the little dial thing that has normally numbers 1 to 3 and then -3 on the other side, and you'll have a little triangle that moves back and forth to show you whether something is overexposed or underexposed. You can use that, but I think especially when you're getting started, it can be easier to just do the guess and check method. Just remember that when you're looking through your viewfinder on a DSLR, that is an optical viewfinder, not an electronic viewfinder, which means when I just look through this viewfinder right now, I see what I would physically see through this lens. I don't see what my end picture is gonna look like. But if you were looking through a viewfinder, say on a Sony RX100 or any of the mirrorless, Sony cameras, then that viewfinder is going to show you what your final image looks like because it takes into consideration the camera settings. So I would suggest just start with that 1/200, f1.4, ISO 300, and then guess and check from there. And soon enough, you'll be shooting all of your pictures in full manual. Really what it comes down to is practice. So if you're unsure at first, don't get discouraged, just keep trying, and someday I'm sure you're gonna be a pro. If you like this video or found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. Also, make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss any of my future videos. I upload every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and I make vlogs, videography videos, creative tips, tutorials like this. And as always, I love you all. I hope you're following your dreams, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!